Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, thank you very much for joining me for the last episode of 2022. And I'm looking forward to this one because we're going to take a look back at the most popular podcasts of 2022. So this is according to the data that's produced by Steph, who's our amazing podcast producer. I'd just like to give a massive shout out to Steph, and she's blushing on the other side of the microphone there, for producing and editing these great podcasts, and also for keeping me in check and making sure that we actually do them each week for you. Because when we actually get into the room together and start recording them, I really do enjoy doing it. And because at the end of the day, we wanted to dispel myths and share tips on all things ISO standards. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to the podcast so far this year. So yeah, let's look at the top 5 then, most listened to podcasts in 2022. Well, interestingly, a couple of them are pretty generic and they apply to businesses regardless of the ISO standard, apart from the last 2, which I'll come on to. So the most popular one was episode number 98, What is a Management Review? So clearly there are a lot of listeners out there that aren't that familiar with management review or need some guidance and support. And that was actually the first of a 3-part series. And one of them, it wasn't that one, it was another one within that series, which was one of my personal favourites. And we're actually going to be recording another podcast on my favourite podcast of 2022 in the new year, in the first week back. But yeah, this podcast, What is a Management Review, basically broke down management review and dispelled a lot of myths about it. Explained how to get started with management review for the very first time and why it's important for businesses. And I think one of the things that was quite popular was the best practice tips on the do's and don'ts. And ultimately, I did provide a bit of a more technical aspect to it and looking at what the standard actually required from management review. So yeah, here's a little extract from that podcast. So the standard actually makes it really easy for businesses to have the meeting because it actually provides details of what should be included on the agenda. So it's not like you need to scratch your head and think, oh, what are we going to include in a management review? When you look at any of the standards, it will have an inputs and outputs section. And so it makes it crystal clear exactly what should be on your agenda. So it's a bit of a cheat, really, but why not use it? Because, these standards have been created by industry leaders from across the globe. So, it's a great basis, I would say, for management review, but you don't need to restrict yourself to just those agenda items. And also you may find that some agenda items you review more regularly, like any issues, incidents, or opportunities for improvement, whereas items on the agenda like reviewing an environmental policy, you don't need to do that every month. That could be once a year maybe. And objectives, you might tie that into a quarterly meeting that you already have within the business. You may have a leadership meeting once a quarter or even every month if you're looking at, drilling down, review of KPIs and that sort of thing. So going back to the inputs then, so what the standard says on inputs, and I'm going to take this from the Environmental Standard 14001. So it says that the management review shall include consideration of the status of actions from previous management reviews. Well, obviously, if it's your first one, you don't need to worry about that. Then secondly, changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the environmental management system. So external issues could be COVID, it could be the war in Ukraine. How are those sorts of things affecting access to your suppliers, your products? How could it affect the services that you deliver? How could it affect your employees, your work environment? So there are lots of different considerations there that it's useful to review periodically, which are things that are generally outside of your control, but they could have an impact on your business. Also looking at the needs and expectations of interested parties, including compliance obligations. So obviously these are the needs of your staff, your employees, any other regulatory bodies as well. And so it's important that you keep them on the agenda to review periodically to see how that could affect your services. In this case, for environmental management, we're looking at significant environmental aspects. So it may be that energy is the most significant environmental aspect, and with the price increase in energy, again, that's bringing in the external issues. How's that going to affect your business and profitability? Looking at the bottom line. So the second most popular podcast of 2022 was how to get the most out of your management review. So clearly this theme was a popular one. And I was absolutely delighted to be joined by Rachel Churchman, who's a managing consultant at Blackmores. So she's an expert in her field. She has chaired numerous management review meetings and has a number of different ways and styles for doing a management review. It doesn't necessarily have to be a meeting. And yeah, it was a really interesting conversation that I had with Rachel that I think originally was due to be about 10 or 15 minutes. And we actually ended up getting on our soapbox and putting the world to rights about management review and going on for nearly an hour. But clearly it was a popular one. But yeah, definitely enjoyed having a chat with Rachel about that because, we have got lots of experience to share. And it was great to talk about some of the downsides to doing a management review really badly, but the upsides, when you do get it right, how it can really help to move your business forward. So yeah, that was an awesome one to have a chat with Rachel about that, which I really enjoyed. So here's a little snippet on how to get the most out of your management review. So, yeah, Rachel, in your view, what would you say is the purpose of management review?
So for me, management review is for the business, not the assessor. Quite often, you will go into a business and you'll read a management review report and everything's perfect. Everything's on the up, everything's improving. They've not had any issues. There's nothing they can learn from as a business from their management review, and there's very few actions. And, whilst that might make everyone feel good that their management system is obviously absolutely perfect, they're not getting any value out of that management review process. And a bit of a top tip for anyone who gets assessed by Blackmores, if you like. We will always look at previous management review reports, and we won't just go back to the last one. We'll have a look at a couple of management review reports, because that will give us an indication of whether it's actually a bit of a cut and paste exercise. Has everyone actually been involved in the management review?
Which some companies are guilty of, aren't they, we find? Yes.
Absolutely, and you can really get a feel for it.
Yeah, we're like, this looks remarkably like last year's and the year before and the year before. And we're like, well, what's actually changed? What's going on in the business? Yeah.
Exactly, and it's a real shame because the companies are just leaving so many opportunities for improvement on the table just by not doing management review as designed. There's so many sort of hints and tips within the management review inputs that the standards prescribe themselves anyway that just aren't really being utilised by the business. The inputs, the first one on the agenda in any management standard is changes, internal and external issues. And quite often you can see that just kind of skimmed across. Oh yeah, there's been no changes in the business. We've not done anything. That's not really what the standards are looking for. And that's not really what the business is going to get any benefit from if they're just sort of thinking internally as to their processes. It's wanting them to really have a look at what's going on in the world. What's impacting their business externally, but also what's happening internally, and it's not just services we deliver, it's people, it's culture, it's how we work, it's where we work, which is quite topical after COVID. Once people or businesses start thinking a little bit out of the box just for that one input, they're going to suddenly see lots of changes in the business, lots of things that are changing around them that can present risks and opportunities to the business. I think that's where we started, Mel, in our management review. The first sort of question I asked was around, okay, so what's changed internally? What's changed externally? And we actually went and looked at our business risk register and started really sort of drilling down.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And as a result, I think we added I think at that point we actually added 5 or 6 different new issues to our risk register for us to action, just as a result of that one question.
Yeah, that was right. And in fact, I'm happy to share with our audience, some of the topics that we did actually discuss and actions that were taken forward. So, let's run through our management review and what we actually covered, because I think sometimes it's useful for listeners to have some kind of context. So, if we're talking about internal and external issues, well, they might be thinking, well, we haven't really had any, but we had quite a few, didn't we?
Yeah, there was loads, but they were positive as well.
Yeah, I mean, but it was things like, we had an office move and there were certain issues associated with that, and still some issues going on with it at that time, because we'd literally only moved offices like about a week or two before, I think, the management review. But also we identified some single points of failure as well, like authorising or proofreading proposals and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it didn't look that pretty, but this is real life. All businesses have risks and they're continuously being bombarded with certain risks and threats, aren't we? So I think the main thing is to talk about it, identify what we're going to do about it, and commit to that, take action and identify kind of key accountabilities for reducing those risks.
I think the important thing there, Mel, is it's not just highlighting the risks or highlighting the opportunities, but we actually had the open discussion involving the right people to actually work through, well, how are we going to learn from this, or what action are we going to take? And it meant that the management review was doing what it's meant to do, which is drive that improvement by having actual actions coming out.
Yeah, and quite often these are things that are outside of our control. So it's useful to bring those people together to decide on, well, this could be totally alien territory. How are we going to tackle this? So things that that are coming up, things that, I don't know, Windows 11 upgrades, we kind of made a note and discussed that, didn't we? And made a decision on what we were going to do and what we weren't going to do. But things like, what's happened with COVID, that was still a really topical issue, for our business, even in January 2022, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I'm seeing this with a lot of clients as well. COVID is still up there on the risk register, but rather than it being a risk, more and more now we're seeing in management review COVID being reflected as an opportunity, because the whole hybrid working has actually resulted in a positive coming out of a negative. And it's great to see that when that does appear in management review, and the actions that they're taking as a result of that in terms of flexible working for staff and positive changes they're making in their business.
The third most popular podcast of 2022 was something that I think a lot of businesses are aware of, but they're not quite sure what they actually are. And they are the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG. So a lot of organisations are talking about ESG and SDG, but some individuals are still figuring it out and wondering, what does it actually mean and what do we need to do? What are these Sustainable Development Goals? So this is where I explained about the purpose of the Sustainable Development Goals and, starting from the very basics, in that the fact that, the world is facing a major crisis, not just on climate change, but in hunger, poverty and inequality as well. So these 17 Sustainable Development Goals help to tackle those issues so that we can hopefully create a better place to live in this world by 2030. So, it was interesting to talk about how the SDGs affect our day-to-day lives. And I also started to explain about the links and the connections with ISO standards and how organisations could actually start to think about applying them. I also mentioned quite a lot of other standards during that podcast that some of you will be familiar with. And then I think for some people it was a bit of a light bulb moment, and how they can connect the dots between the ISO standards that they're certified to and the Sustainable Development Goals. So here's a brief extract where I'm explaining about how some of the standards connect. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by all United Nations member states back in 2015, provides a shared blueprint, and that's a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and in the future. And at its heart are those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and we covered the first 9 in the previous episode, and I'm going to be covering 10 to 17 in this episode today. Because at the end of the day, we have got an urgent call for action by all countries to address these 17 goals. That's both in the developed and developing countries. It is truly a global partnership. And at the end of this podcast, we'll be looking at Goal 17, which is how ISO standards play a part in that global partnership. But all 17 Sustainable Development Goals recognise, that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and of course spur economic growth as well. But at the same time, trying to tackle climate change whilst working to preserve our oceans and our forests. So without further ado, I'm going to dive straight into the remaining Sustainable Development Goals that we touched upon. Now, some of you that are listening might be thinking, well, I only cover ISO 9001. What's that got to do with the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, when you go into the ISO.org website, you'll be able to see that 9001 alone covers 4 SDGs, 4 Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at ISO 14001, which I know that many of our ISO show listeners will be certified against, that actually covers 12 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so I won't continue on because I'm keen to get stuck into the 10th SDG, which is reduced inequalities. But I just wanted to kind of put it into context that a lot of the work that you're currently doing is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we could be doing a lot more. So in terms of goal number 10, reduced inequalities, many developing countries are suffering from a lack of standards, which can be a major impediment to their integration into regional and global markets, which in turn can limit the opportunities that are offered by trade. And then obviously the knock-on effect of that is that it's hindering the ability to improve public welfare in vital areas such as health and safety and environmental protection. But ISO standards themselves contribute to the reduction of these inequalities because they serve as a common language. We know that these ISO standards are applicable to all businesses across all sectors of all sizes, regardless of where you're located in the world. So they do truly represent a common language of best practice, which ultimately helps to break down barriers to trade. They can help to promote innovation and also level up the playing field for organisations of all types wishing to compete at a higher level, whether that's at national or international level. And we know that firsthand that this is true. I've mentioned this story a couple of times on the podcast, but we had a guy who was working from his garage. It was him and his wife, and they knew that they wanted to achieve ISO standards in order to be able to grow their business, to have a sustainable business, and to act responsibly and do the right thing. And they did. They implemented ISO 9001, 14001 and 45. So that's quality, environment and health and safety. And they went on to becoming a really successful organisation, turning over millions. So I think it just proves a point that this does help to level up the playing field. Many organisations come to us because they want to achieve better standards, but they also want to be able to pitch for bigger contracts as well. So it does help to address any kind of imbalances in that area in business. But when we're looking at it from a social responsibility perspective, the main standard I would suggest here is ISO 26000. So that's the guidance standard. So it's not a specification, it's not a certification standard that you will get a badge for, but it's a fantastic tool to provide you with all the information that you need on social responsibility. Okay, so it provides guidelines on how you can operate in a socially responsible way. So this is all about addressing inequalities, which includes encompassing, the principles of non-discrimination and, of course, equal opportunities. So moving on to Sustainable Development Goal number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. So the flagship standard for sustainable cities and communities is ISO 37101. Okay, so that's 37101, which helps communities define their sustainable development objectives. What do they want to achieve, how are they going to get there, and implementing the strategies in order to be able to achieve them. So this covers a lot of different areas such as responsible use of resources, preserving the environment, and improving the well-being of citizens within those sustainable cities and communities. And due to its increasing popularity, there's now a series of standards, including ISO 37120, which are the indicators for city services and quality of life. And there's a couple of up-and-coming standards in this area as well in the same series, which are the indicators for smart cities and resilient cities. So they're 37122 and 37123. But there's also literally hundreds of standards on intelligent transport systems, water management, business continuity, and community resilience. Okay, so one of those standards that you've probably heard of is ISO 22301 on business continuity management. But this is all about creating a resilient future. Okay, it's building in resilience into our way of life so that we can become more sustainable and adaptive to the challenges that we all face. So the fourth and fifth most popular podcasts were actually related to one particular standard, and that was ISO 27002 2022. So that was hot off the press. That was episode 109 and 110. But following on from that, we did actually break down some of the controls in more detail. And we did get a lot of downloads on those podcasts as well. So that was when we went into a bit more detail on the changes. So basically, ISO 27002 had been published this year to explain about specific information security controls that covered, cybersecurity, privacy protection. And ultimately, we provided like a high-level overview of the purpose of 27002, how it actually interlinks with ISO 27001, which is the certifiable standard for information security, and just a bit of an overview of the changes. So that seemed to be really popular when it came to, a standard-specific podcast. And it's interesting because 27002 is not a certifiable standard, but it is best practice. And it is a great document for anybody that wants to look at improving their information security controls. And of course, that was a bit of a precursor to the latest version of ISO 27001 that did come out later on in 2022. And as we know, all businesses that are certified to 27001 have now got 3 years to migrate to the new version of that standard. And I'm delighted to say that next year in 2023, we'll have Steve Mason back on the podcast for explaining about how to migrate to the new standard. So that was really interesting. So that was episode 109 on what's new with ISO 27002. And the fifth most popular was what are the 11 new controls in 27002. So that's where we explained in a lot more detail about the new controls. Here's a little extract from that podcast.
Before we go into the controls in any detail, it'd be good just to pick up on some of the changes that happened with 27002. I think the first thing is to really bear in mind that the document is completely different from the previous 27002 standard. And I think it's a much better standard than before. I've heard people grumbling about it, but to be quite honest, I can't see what there is to grumble about. I think it opens a lot of opportunities for organisations. And the other thing is that all these new controls, there are 11 new controls. People will be thinking, oh, crikey, that's more work to do. To be quite honest, I've run through this standard with a couple of clients now, and in both cases, they've all said, but we already do that. And so I think these new controls are not a case of they're new controls, they're just emphasising activities that companies already do. So that's the thing to bear in mind. So don't panic about these controls. You'll probably find you've already got things in place. But if we go back to the actual standard, if we remember back in the old standard, we had sections A5, A6, A7, A8, and so on and so forth. In this one, we've only got 4 sections. We've got organisation, people, physical, and technological. What this has enabled the standards people to do is to reduce the number of duplicated controls. Because often you find a control in one set of controls, and you then think, all right, done that. Then you move on to another set of controls, you find the same control repeated, but in a slightly different way. But that's now been removed in that sense. Then when we look at these controls, each of them has been aligned to different attribute themes. So this is one of the big changes in the standard. We've got attributes and we've got sub-attributes. So the attributes are control type, information security properties, cybersecurity concepts, operational capabilities, and security domains. Now, maybe some people are already thinking, oh, I recognise those. Well, if you're into NIST or any of the other security, I guess, criteria and guidelines, they align with those. So it's going to enable you with your 27001 to say, well, I'm dealing with it in 27001, but I can see how it meets NIST requirements or how it meets SAS 70, all those sorts of standards that are around. Okay. And then below that, we have the sub-attributes, which that's a name that I've given them. And these are all the different individual bits that make up those attributes. But you'll get to know those as you go along. The good thing about the standard is that when you open up the standard, you find the control number, and it immediately gives you a set of the attributes and sub-attributes that are covered by that control number. Now, this can help with analysis, because if you know what your attributes are, if you know what your sub-attributes are, you can do yourself a bit of analysis to build up a maturity picture of how well you're putting those controls together. Also, a picture of which attribute is the weakest in your business. So you might be looking at control as an attribute type, and it might be preventative that comes up a lot as being a weakness. So you've got to improve your preventative. There might be one that says detective. That's where you've got to improve the detection of security and things like that. So this is going to be a benefit to organisations in doing some analysis. And at Blackmores, we've already developed a maturity assessment to help clients with this. But more on that at a later date. I won't go into too much detail on that one. The other good thing about the standard is that not only does it give you the statement of what the control is, it also gives you the purpose of the control. And boy, is that an eye-opener, because how many times have we been in assessments or been in audits and there's been a differing of opinion as to what the control means? Well, I don't think that's going to exist anymore, because the purpose will tell us what we should be aiming to achieve with that control. And that can't then be disputed so easily, unless somebody completely misreads the English in the purpose. But we should be okay with that. And I do like the fact we've got that purpose in there. So those are the real positives that are coming out of this standard. I think if any negative thoughts come out, hold fire on that. Wait until you've actually got into it. Wait until you've started to use it. And I think we'll all be looking back in a year's time, looking back at this standard and saying, wow, this is a breath of fresh air. So then on to the controls that we've got in place. So we've got 3 organisational controls that have been added. One is threat intelligence. The other one is information security for the use of cloud services. The other one is ICT readiness for business continuity. Then we've got one new physical control, and that's physical security monitoring. Then finally, we've got 7 technological controls. That's configuration management, information deletion, data masking, data leakage prevention, monitoring activities, web filtering, and secure coding. Now, people listening to that list, all of those controls, would have probably thought, well, yeah, I recognise that. I mean, threat intelligence. Who's not doing threat intelligence nowadays? Who's not thinking about security in the cloud? Who's not doing data masking or information deletion because of GDPR and the Data Protection Act? And who's not sort of trying to prevent data leakage? And I think this is where, as I said right at the beginning, that these controls are emphasising the changes that are happening within information security. It's a bit of a catch-up situation, which is always going to be the case with standards, because if they don't change for 7 years, then you'll always be in a situation where you'll be looking at, well, where's the market and where's it catching up? And I think people should always see the standards as a starting point and gradually add new controls as they know they need to add when things change within the IT security world.
So yeah, definitely worthwhile taking a listen to one of those episodes if you are interested in raising your game in information security in 2023. Before I go, I think it might be worthwhile mentioning that we get a lot of downloads on YouTube. So even though this is audio, we do download our audio to YouTube because we do get a lot of listeners on there. And interestingly, we did have some similar ones that were in the most popular 5, like the management review and also the controls on 27002. But we had another 2 podcasts that were in the top 5 that wasn't in the podcast one on YouTube, which was how to prepare for a surveillance audit, and also 10 top tips for getting you through a surveillance audit. So for those of you that are new to the podcast or new to ISO standards, you might be thinking, what the heck is a surveillance audit? It sounds a bit scary. Well, that's actually the annual review that a certification body does once you become certified. And for some people, it can be quite daunting. I mean, the assessment can be bad enough in some people's views, but when it comes to the annual surveillance, they are wondering what to expect. And so that's when I explain, based on years of experience of helping clients through their annual surveillance audits, and also when I was a practicing quality manager back in the day as well, about experience and kind of, the do's and don'ts and what to expect during a surveillance visit. So yeah, really interesting to see what was the most popular podcast, both listened to on the various players, whether it's Spotify or SoundCloud, or catching it on YouTube. So either way, it's been an absolute pleasure to record these podcasts and be able to share some of those stories and hints and tips with the guests that we've had on the podcast. And yeah, I'd just really like to thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure and an honour to do that. And look forward to recording some more podcasts for you in 2023. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast this year, please do leave us a comment on the player that you do listen to. It does make all the difference with helping us to reach a much wider audience and get the ISO show name out there. So we would really, really appreciate you leaving a shiny 5-star review whenever you get a moment. That would be awesome. So yeah, look forward to catching up with you in 2023.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.